Welcome to the Joy of Automating. I'm Franklin Weber. Community cookbooks are incredibly powerful and difficult to understand. In this episode, we are going to focus on using community cookbooks. We'll develop an actual cookbook from scratch, from just an installation instructions. We'll write some tests, and then we'll refactor it to use a community cookbook. And then if we have a few moments of time near the end, we'll actually explore the implementation of those community cookbooks. As I said, they're powerful tools, but they're often confusing in their implementation. Well, it's an exciting day. Let's start practicing. Alright, welcome to the Joy of Automating. So like I said, we're going to focus on using community cookbooks here. And we're going to start actually by implementing a Jenkins cookbook and following the installation instructions as we would normally. Now, these installation instructions are pretty straightforward. We'll take a look at them here. And let me paste this into the chat so everyone can participate. We've got a new home in the Learn Chef library, the Learn Chef library there. So here's a link to that. You can also find it down below in the description if you're not following along in the chat. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and let's get started. So the implementation that we are going to look at here is, so there's that page. This is the Jenkins installation. Let me increase the font of this just a bit. So the installation is a pretty straightforward one for most installation recipes. Here it's different, I guess, from what I'm used to. I'm used to downloading the package from source and then taking that source and unzipping it, make installing it, and then having the system ready. Here instead, what we're doing is we're actually adding to Ubuntu sort of app library, or essentially its repository, a new package. And that new package contains the information we need to install it. And so after we add that to the app repository, we essentially are able to install Jenkins through a normal package installation. So here's a bunch of pre-work. We can see here, like the pre-work of setting up the repository. And then here's us updating, and then finally we do the installation at the end. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So I'm going to go to the command line here. And I am going to put this over on the right, have this over here on the, I'll put this on the left and then have the installation instruction on the right. I'm going to use Chef to generate me a cookbook. So in this case, I'm going to generate a cookbook. I'm just going to call it Jenkins. Okay. And then I'm going to use my editor for today to open up, not my entire directory. That's exactly what I did there. But what I wanted to do was change into the Jenkins directory and then open this up. All right. All right. And it looks like we're all set up and ready to go. So let me get out of the way here. All right. So here is our code. And I'm going to move this over to the left-hand side. I have a default recipe at this moment, right? A default recipe that contains no information. And I could immediately start copying in that content right there. I could immediately start copy that content in there. But, in this case, my installation instructions right above my head here. In that moment, I'm thinking, well, really, I should be writing a test. What's the proof, right? What's the proof that this thing is actually installed? So I'm going to start with the actual test itself. And I believe by default, and it says here, it says by default Jenkins is listening on port 8080. So what my hope is that when I deploy the system, I'm going to have something up on 8080, and I think that's where we should actually start. So my default recipe is a good place, essentially I could write things. It's good to write an end goal to make sure that I've got that in mind and keep me focused here. So I'm going to write this, and I think in this case, I'm going to actually, instead of using server spec, I'm going to use inspec to do it. So let's start actually in the kitchen configuration file before I do any writing. In the kitchen configuration file for the chef development kit, you'll notice now if you're working with it, it'll show this line right here which says uncomment the following line to enable the verifier inspec. So I'm going to uncomment that line and enable the verifier inspec. And, oh yeah, right, I only want Ubuntu, so I'll do that. So really, the test is not the place to start, the kitchen configuration file is. Now I've made a small change. In this case, I'm now using the inspect verifier. I want to probably update my test suite to be aware of that. So I'm going to change the server spec directory to inspect. And I'm just going to leave everything as is and hope that it just works. Now, server spec and inspec are pretty close to each other in terms of their implementations. Inspec does a good job of trying to maintain most of the server spec implementation stuff, and so there's a few problems that might come up along the way, and we'll troubleshoot them, and I'm familiar with it. So this is also going to serve to show you a little bit of how you might transition server spec to inspec here. So if I'm familiar with previous things that I've done, usually I'm describing a command, and that command is going to be requesting information from the server to ensure that the website's up and running. In this case, I'm fairly certain from doing this before, working with Ubuntu systems, that I don't know if curl actually happens to be installed on the system. Normally I would just do a curl localhost here. But I think in some cases it's going to be a wget, right? I think we're going to do something a little bit different. I think it's going to be a wget, and I believe there's some parameters for that are going to store the value. So I'm not sure exactly what. We'll take a look at it in just a moment, but I think this is what I need to do, which is say, hey, I want to request the local website, and I want to store that information, output the information to the command line. And I'm going to say it's standard out. Let me turn off wrapping for a second here. So its standard out is going to, or should match, should match, and I don't know what it should match. I'm assuming maybe Jenkins, right? The word Jenkins will probably be in the output somewhere. If the name of the product's Jenkins, then there's probably Jenkins on the page, right? Something like that. All right. And that gives us a good starting expectation. So I'm going to run this in the command line. So I'm going to switch over to my terminal, and I'm going to my kitchen list. And my kitchen list over there, right, is going to run, and it tells me that I have everything set up what I want. The default test suite right there with Ubuntu platform 14.04. I'm using inspec as my verifier, and if I made that just a little bit wider, you'll see it says the last action not created. So let's actually create that one. So kitchen, and actually I've got my test already, so let's just try kitchen verify. Let's see what happens. So I don't have any actual, in this case, recipes defined, but I have my one test set up for me. Now I'm going to let that run in the background. That's going to take as long as it's going to take for you, barring sort of internet outages and things like that. Hopefully this is going to be working for me. So this will download in just a moment or two. Let's return back to the setup instructions and see if we can get to started with the implementation. So I'm not familiar. I think that's probably right. I won't doubt it too much. I'll let my test tell me if it's not right. All right, and I'm going to return back to the default recipe. And this default recipe is really just going to contain all this information that I'm now highlighting here. And I'm just going to copy this information from here into my recipe itself. And I'm going to make this a little bit larger. And I'll turn off wrapping so it looks as though it's in this all on one line as they are, sort of the single lines. And really, I'm going to convert these lines into, I'm going to convert these lines into chef resources. So right now, I'm just going to put a big comment around this. So I'm highlighting all the text and then commenting it as a group. And I'm going to go one by one to do these things. So using a wget is pulling in a remote file. So I'm going to bring in a remote file. I think that's what I want to do here. That's going to be exactly what I'm doing, at least that's what I think I'm doing, right? I'm pulling down a remote file, I'm outputting it, and I'm saving it, and I'm pushing it, and then I'm doing something with it. So then it says sudo apt key add, and then it's adding, I think, the current key that I just downloaded. So I don't care where it goes. I just assume as long as it gets installed somewhere, and I'll just put a key right here. Shall I paste this? And the source location is going to be this right here. And I've decided, I think here is what I want. I want this value really to be the key name. So I'm going to take that key name and put that here. And now that's the source location. Now this is not all the command right here, because remember there's this little bit of a command that I'm piping this into here. So there's another command that we have to run, which is going to be sudo apt key add. So I'm going to do an execute, and I'm going to assume here that I don't need to run sudo, but I have to say apt key add, and I can't say dash, so I'm probably going to say literally the path that I'm saving the key here. That's my guess at the moment. So I'm going to copy that there. And then if I look at this instruction right here, this, and let me wrap this because I think that'll be easier to see. It says, I want to run a shell and I want to echo this content into this package list. Okay, so I can use an execute for that. So I'm going to say execute, echo this content, whatever this happens to be, echo deb, HTTP package Jenkins, Debian, binary slash into this file right here. So that's something that I think it's just writing the file. So it's just writing the file. So actually, because this is just writing a file, right? It's not appending. If it was appending a file, it would be this. But because it's writing a file, just outputting the content, I think I can use a file resource. And I'm going to use the file resource here to replace this. And then the content that I want in there, I believe, is just this right here, right? All of this content here. I'll use that file resource to do that work, and I think that looks pretty good. Now finally, I'm going to do an execute of an apt get update, and then I'm going to do an execute of this, but apt get install Jenkins, right? At this moment, that's where I'm just going to be using a package. So I'm just going to be doing a normal package install, and hopefully my package system is set up for me. So I'm going to run this and just do package Jenkins. All right, so that looks pretty good. That's our final recipe here. Like I said, we've been running the tests in the background, and this is taking a little bit of time, so I like to just kind of get ahead a little bit here and just write a little bit of the implementation out. Now, we could, at this moment, start doing some unit tests of things to kind of figure this out, but I don't know. I'm not yet convinced that this is going to be the final implementation. Let's take a look at this implementation, kind of talk about it, and what we like, what we don't like about this thing. So first and foremost, this key process. We pull down the key here, right? We pull down this key, and I think this is because it's wrapped. Yeah, we pull down this key, and we store the key. Then we install the key. And the problem is we're going to install this key every single time. But I don't want it to install every single time. I only want the key to install if this key were to be downloaded the first time or if the key were to be updated. So I really don't want this to essentially execute every time. I only want this key to be installed, essentially this command to be run, if and only if this remote file were to take action. So I'm going to set up a sort of chain of events. I'm going to do a notify. So I'm going to say this is going to notify. This notifies what action? The run action, right? So execute resource and run action. I'm going to tell it to execute this right here. And I'm going to grab this code right here, and we'll start with that. And I'm going to say run this command. And I don't want this, by default it's going to do, right? It's going to say, hey, I'm going to do this essentially delayed, meaning it's going to wait a little bit for it to be done. I want this to happen immediately, right? I want this chain of events to happen immediately. So I am going to set this to run here, and so this is going to run. Now, I don't want this to run every time. I want this to be triggered, actually, when this happens. So I want a trigger to take place. So I need to stop this from running every single time. So I'm going to write action nothing, actually. And then if I look ahead, I see this file resource. I don't really need to worry about this one being called right away, right? I don't care if this happens right away. But I do care that if this takes action, this file resource were to take action, were to update or modify itself in any way, I want this apt-get update to be called. So again, I'm going to run another notifies. So we're going to do another notifies here. And I'm going to say notifies run to the execute apt-get update resource, and I want that to happen immediately, because I believe if it doesn't happen immediately, what's going to happen is that package is not going to be available, right? The Jenkins package is not going to be present, or whatever this gets updated to support. So let's make sure that happens. So again, this is something that I don't want to execute every single time. I'm going to leave this as nothing and allow this to fire this event here. And then finally, this package Jenkins, that's essentially got the right test and repair set up, so that should work for us. Now I've done a lot of implementation, a lot of guess, but let's take a look at our test suite and see what's going on. And it looks like what we're getting is an error here. So remember, we're trying a little bit, a new thing here. At least a new thing in the sense of trying out inspect as the verifier. And if you look at the error message, it's telling us that it cannot load the file spec helper. So one thing that I remember reading about what's nice about essentially inspect over server spec is that we actually don't need, in the default spec here, we don't need this spec helper line. And actually we don't need that whole spec helpers directory right here. So we could delete this. I didn't actually rename this, but let's just delete this here. So I'm going to delete that. All right, and I'll close this file. So let's just run this again, kitchen verify. So our system is already converged, so it should just be a quick verification. And now here you get another error, and it says undefined method command for RSpec example group Jenkins default class. Okay, so that is something that's a little strange, right? Why is it showing us this error with command? Command is usually or previously worked. And the reason for this actually is that inspect doesn't require you to put this outside sort of casing around this scope around it, that the describe block around it. They assume or they know that it happens to be the right recipe, the right test suite, things like that. So really you just need to outline all the commands that you want to execute, all the sort of expectations you're defining. And so this is going to be the final implementation. I believe that's about right. So let's run kitchen verify again and see what's happening here. All right, return to the command line here. And all right, and of course we're looking for a failure. Here we do get a failure, right? Because we don't have the implementation. I was working on the implementation while we were setting up this test, and we see the command wget-o-localhost should match Jenkins. It got nothing, no content, but we expected Jenkins. And then there's of course our spec and its line number where it's at. So we have one example, one failure. We're in the right spot to get started here. So now let's run kitchen converge. So kitchen converge is going to converge our system. Let's see if that works without error before running a kitchen verify. And see what happens here. All right, so that looks like our resource taking place, and I'm not familiar with actually the app repository. So you'll see here we actually downloaded that key. So here's us downloading that key. And then again, this is all the content for the key that goes along with it. That key is getting saved to that temp directory, and then the apt-get add the key happened here, so that worked for us. And then we created the new Jenkins list file, and now we're doing an apt-get update. So we're probably just waiting for that to finish, right? An apt-get update, which is going to update any of the repositories, essentially make sure our package list is up to date, and a little bit of pruning is probably going on and things like that. So it's going to take just a small moment here. But once that's done, I think we should see this converge, because we've got to this part. I mean, I guess if we got it right, what's going to happen is we're going to see the package essentially, the package installation of Jenkins works successfully. And I know for the Jenkins installation, based on the instructions, which I'm going to switch back to here, It does say it does some work for us. What's nice about the package installation instructions for Jenkins is that it takes care of generating a user, writing our log files, starting services, everything like that. So we don't need to worry about that. Of course, that does mean that it installs all of its dependencies as well. So this could take some time while it's actually converging on the system. So we might need to leave this for a moment and come back to it to kind of see that. And there it goes, it failed for us. And I see that it failed here. So running hooks, extracting templates, and it tells us that it failed down below. So this is the converge line. So this big red part right here, if you can see the color red, is saying, hey, I tried to run Chef Client on the machine, and that's not great. And then we get an error up here, and let's take a look at this error. Actually, let's search the internet for this error, because I don't know what this means when it says sub-process installation post-installation script return error with exit status 7. And I think we could ask anything, but really I want to focus on Jenkins. So let's just go here and look through Jenkins. And then here looks like a link that's probably going to give us some help. Yeah, let me make this a little bit larger. So here we're now in the Jenkins issue database. And it tells me that when installing Jenkins 1.639, this Jenkins probably does or generates the same error. Now, I think for us, we're not installing 1.6.39. We have a different version number, but the error seems pretty similar. Yeah, we're 1.656. So let's take a look here. The same failure doesn't happen for older packages. And if I look through these comments, I think there's one that happens to tell us what's going on. Jenkins now appears to require Java 7. And you know what? I've been troubleshooting this issue on a fresh Ubuntu 14.04 system. That's us, right? We're Ubuntu 14.04. And then determine that the root cause happens to be incorrect ordering of installation dependencies. App attempts to install Jenkins before it does OpenJDK JRE headless. So apparently the installation instructions are wrong. What we probably need to do then was actually just on our installation put this OpenJDK 7 JRE headless and put that somewhere in the recipe to make that work. So I'm just going to copy that package name, and I'm going to return back to our editor, and I am going to back to the default recipe. And right before we do the package Jenkins, I'm just going to do this, which is going to say install this right here. And actually, just for the sake of posterity, I'm going to copy this issue, down this issue, which, you know, with the installation, to kind of leave myself a reason why. Because someone might look at this and go, hey, why are you doing this? It's already taken care of. So this is something I just like to do. Is a lot of times, if I find great issues that give me a lot of information, I like to include them in a comment above them. All right, so this is going to take a little bit of time, I think, as it installs Java, but hopefully everything will work correctly here. Now that it's converged, let's see if it verifies. Hopefully the installation was able to complete successfully, right? I'm not sure if it was, because of course if it wasn't able to finish successfully, we might have to rebuild the system or do something like uninstall the Jenkins package to make this work. So I'm not sure. I'm going to troubleshoot the system a little bit. So I'm going to log into the system and see what's going on. So let's log into the system and see, number one, first, does my wget command work that I was thinking of? Because I remember I was saying curl doesn't work. So wget-o- localhost. And did I say 8080? Because, I don't think I'm getting what I'm hoping to get, which is I'm hoping to get the site to come back, right? So in this case, permission denied. Permission denied. What if I just said wget localhost connection refused? How about 8080? Connection refused. So I think in some case we've got a problem here. I think the state of the system is a little bit weird. So I'm not sure. Let's return back to a recipe. I'm going to do something a little strange right now. I could recreate, blow everything away, and try and sort of rebuild this, but it's going to take a little bit of time. So maybe what I can do is actually just uninstall this package and then try and reinstall it. So let's try that. So I'm just going to do action, and I'm going to do action uninstall. I believe that's the uninstall. And I'm going to exit out of the system because I believe, I think if I do apt get, I'm not even sure, like apt install, we could do apt list, and I could see Jenkins. I bet Jenkins is installed. Yeah, it's now all installed, but Jenkins is not running as we're seeing here, right? I can't actually get it going, so there was a failure here. So I am going to uninstall it, and then I'm going to install it. I know it sounds crazy, but this is going to save us some time. Normally I just blow away the instance, but I have a feeling that if I blow away the instance, we're going to lose a lot of time just waiting for that, essentially, to create and the converge to happen again. So hopefully this will be able to solve it. Alright, what did I type wrong here? Oh, you pass uninstall, remove. Oh, okay. Well, that's good. I didn't know the command. I haven't done it before. I've never really uninstalled a package before. So it said, here's the list of all the possible actions, right? Nothing, install, upgrade, remove, purge, reconfigure, and I said uninstall. So I chose the wrong verb here in this moment. Okay. That looks good. So I removed the package Jenkins, and I've got it installed. Let's try kitchen verify again, and hopefully we'll see success in this case. I've got that all right. Still a failure. Well, let's fix something. Let's remove this remove line because I don't need that anymore. Hopefully this has been installed correctly. And then I'm going to return the command line. I'm going to log back into the system and take a look to see what's going on with it. And I'm going to wget. And you know what, I think this is where I'm going to call to localhost. So localhost :8080 and connected. So that's waiting for response, and it gave me content back. But that doesn't show the content of it. I believe if I do -O, capital O, or just lowercase o, either one of those will work. And I see a lowercase o doesn't work, but capital O does work. And I believe if I were to grep for Jenkins, that value is somewhere within it, and it is. So I think I have a problem with that test. So I'm going to leave the instance right here. I'm going to return to my test. So I have my default, my test integration spec. First problem was the lowercase o. Second problem is I'm calling on port 80, not 8080. That's where the installation happens to be. So let's return back to the command line. I think we're going to see this work. Let's hope it works. That's why our test suite is so good. It helps us figure out these issues. And yes, there we go. All right. Super happy about that. So now we have this implementation, and we know that it works, that the system is happening to work for us. So we've got a Jenkins server at least showing us the default test page. So I truly don't know if it's actually working or not. It might be configured incorrectly, but at least based on the setup instructions so far, we've got it installed. So let's now look at some of the next steps that we can follow here. So I'm going to return back to my recipe. And we've got everything set up, and we did our best to kind of make the recipe as idempotent, as strong as it is in terms of test repair. Because when we run kitchen Converge now, let's take a look. I believe we've done everything smart so that what we're going to see is 0 resources affected, right? That's important. Right? When we have a resource run, this is super important for us to see this. To see chef client finish with 0 out of 6 resources. We don't want a noisy chef client run, essentially resources constantly taking action and constantly taking action. So it's nice to see this, and I feel like the implementation here we have is pretty darn good. So this is the start. And this is one of those moments where I finish an implementation and I think to myself, well, what did somebody else do? Like, how did they implement this in other ways? And what if I need to do this more often? This little bit of a running apt-get update, right? In previous episodes, we had some apt-get update sort of requirements, and I ignored them, mostly because, when do I need to run it? Do I need to run it every single time? And I think we could probably solve this problem by bringing in a community cookbook. So before we do that, though, it's a good time to save our work, to save everything we've completed so far. So let's do that. So I'm going to return to the command line. And I'm going to do git status. And I'm going to add everything. I think this initial implementation is good for us. So here's all the files that are added. That's going to take care of everything. And I'm just going to do initial commit. So this is the initial commit. This installs and tests the installation of Jenkins, the server. I like it. All right. And we did a pretty good job in terms of that. Now let's move on to looking at a community cookbook and the way that they solve the problem. So I'm going to go to the supermarket, and in the supermarket, I'm going to actually look for the Jenkins Cookbook. I want to take a little bit of a look at that. And so I'm going to go to this, the Jenkins Cookbook. The other problem is we're looking at app, right? Dealing with app and things like that, and the app repository, and that's where most of our work is being done. So here's the Jenkins Cookbook, and we see here there's a big description, how to use it and how to pull it in. There's a big README here. I'm a big fan of just looking at source code, so I'm going to pull that down, or at least go here to GitHub to see this. And I'm going to make this bigger so you can all see that. All right, so here is the Jenkins Cookbook in source. And we could actually examine it through GitHub. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but if you wanted to say, what is the recipes here? Like, what does it do? You can press the T key, and it turns into this fuzzy find. And in the T key, you can start typing in, like, well, I want recipes/default. And it looks like, I don't know, there's no default in the recipes directory, so let's just do /recipes. And it looks like there's Java, master, master war, and master package. So let's go to master and see what this is. So here in the master recipe, it tells us, here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick the recipe, include the recipe that makes sense based on the install method. And so, and it does, I want _master _ whatever that install method is. So if I go back, press the T key, and I say recipes, those _war and _package methods make a lot of sense. So if we want to look at an implementation similar to ourselves, we're going to look at the package one. So that's the one that I'm interested in. So I'm going to click on that one and take a look at it. All right, and so we can take a look at the implementation. For us, we're interested in, I believe, right here, right, the Debian flavor of installation that's going on. And we can see that this supports multiple platforms. So we have the choice of, multiple ways of installing on multiple platforms. It's nice that we have at least the examples we can see. So this is the implementation that they chose, which is include recipe app default. So it's pulling in the app cookbook's default recipe. Then it's using this resource, a custom resource called app repository. And then it just does package Jenkins, and then it uses the template to sort of set up some of the default values for Jenkins. That's, you know what, that is, thinking about the recipe, looking at that implementation and comparing to ours. I mean, remember, I was proud of our recipe, but what I really love about the community recipe here is that it's really clean. All this app repository stuff is taken care of in this one sort of section right here. And that's, I think, the first part I think we should look at exploring. How can we get that part, just copy that functionality? Because if we could, we'd be able to reduce or remove all of this complexity that we've introduced here, like at least obfuscate it a little bit, make it a little more clear about what's going on, right? All of this move right here is really all about getting the app repository set up so that we can pull in the Jenkins code. And I think we can use the app cookbook to do that as well. So let's take a look and see where it gets that app repository sort of resource that's present. So I'm going to return back to the code. Remember, it says app repository. Now there's not a good way of finding where this app repository comes from. We can look in the cookbook itself, because this is probably a custom resource. We can look under a resources directory if it's present, or maybe a libraries directory. The libraries directory might have it as well. The thing about it, though, is it strikes me as being, when it's sort of that thing where it says apt, I'll go back to it, go back to the recipe, and this apt _ repository, it leads me to believe that it's in a cookbook named apt, and there's a repository resource inside of there. That's just a common convention that takes place with custom resources. So let's see what apt cookbook it brings in. And we can look at that by returning back to the cookbook, staring at the metadata file, and seeing if we see anything about it. And yeah, we do. We see that this cookbook is dependent on the apt cookbook. Right, okay, so that's great. So we want the app cookbook. Oh, look, Yoshi. I love Yoshi. Right. There's apt cookbook there, and it says, give me something around the 2.0 version. So we could go back to the supermarket, and I think that's what we're going to do. So we're going to go back to the supermarket, and I'll look for the apt cookbook. And I'll press enter, we'll do a search. I'm going to click on the apt cookbook here. And I'll see, again, let's go view the source. Now, instead of viewing the source through GitHub, I want to actually do this from the command line. So I'm going to return back to the command prompt here, and I'm going to make another tab inside of my terminal. I'm going to move out of my directory, and I could use Git Clone, right? I could use Git Clone and then copy the content here, you know, that kind of thing. I'm going to use my little helpful tool that I have called Hub Clone. The Hub Clone says, as long as you've got the name and the name of the organization and the cookbook name like this, you can clone it, and that's just going to clone it down. And I like that because a lot of times from the command line I can remember like, oh yeah, I'm going to clone my cookbook down, right? I can easily remember it without making a mistake in terms of that git sort of command. All right, so I'm going to go into the apt cookbook. So we're going to view the cookbook locally instead of viewing it on the web, and there's some benefits to doing that. Because we can now see the code, we can now move through the code like files, kind of like we're doing on the website, but now we can also do some searches and some finds and other things like that. So we have the ability to kind of play with that code. So here is the code for us. Remember the recipe, the one that we were looking at. I'll move this over to the right, move this over to the left, and I'm going to bring up that GitHub location to see the recipe, not for apt, but for this. Remember there was that master war file, so I'll use the T key. I'll say recipes _ master and package. So I'll go here. I want to look at this code again. So the first thing it does is it includes this default recipe, and I think that's what we want to take a look at. So let's look at the recipes here, and inside the recipes I see the default recipe. And here we see that, let me turn off wrapping. So I'm going to close this, open that. It looks like it takes care of a number of things for us. And I'm not familiar with exactly what's going on. It looks like it's writing out a file, or actually not writing out a file, but then writing out a file if necessary. And then setting up an apt-get update and possibly running that if it gets called. And then an apt-get auto-remove if it gets called, and then apt-get auto-clean if it gets called, and then it creates any directories it needs. That's nice. And then it looks like it writes out some configuration files, and then does an apt transport HTTPS. So this default recipe, I think, takes care of some initial groundwork that we might need, something that I'm not familiar with the apt repository. But let's look at the second thing that we can see, which is going to be us looking at this apt repository. So like I said, we couldn't find it in the, essentially the Jenkins Cookbook. So I'm going to look inside of here. So remember, you can find it in the resources or the providers directory. And the old way of doing the lightweight resource providers is that the name of the cookbook _ the name of the Ruby file inside of the resources directory came up with the name of the lightweight resource. So here is the apt _ repository. So this is essentially cookbook name, right? Cookbook name _ this file name, right? And so this file name is repository. So it's apt _ repository. So this is where we want to look. And we see here the resource file defines all the possible actions. That looks good. And then here's the implementation inside of here. So I'll go to repository here. So here's the implementation, which has a bunch of methods, and eventually I'd probably finally get to some actions and stuff like that. So this is where it actually comes from. All right, well, let's actually try to use this within our cookbook itself. So I'm going to return back to the apt cookbook in just a little bit. I'm going to return to our cookbook here, because remember our goal is to replace this code and this code. I'm going to go to the left-hand side. Let's move the browser to the right-hand side. And I'll close this little window. Our goal here is to replace this code, essentially all of this. And we can do that by, it looks like what we want to do is say include recipe. So great artist copy. That's what we're doing here. So I'm just going to save that right now, and I'm going to run this test. And I'm going to return back to our first tab, and I'm running kitchen converge. And I'm hoping that this is going to fail because I'm pulling in a recipe for a cookbook that I don't have. And hopefully in the run list here, things will fail. And it does. It gets to this line right here, and it says, Cookbook not found, Cookbook app not found. If you're loading it, make sure you configure it as a dependency in your metadata. So we need to add that to our metadata. All right, so I'm going to open up the metadata file, so metadata. And inside the metadata, I'm going to define a depends. So I've seen this before, apt. And I'm not going to specify a version number. I'm just going to let it be whatever version it happens to be. Now, when you're working with community cookbooks, you oftentimes want to set a version number to be somewhere in a range that you know that works for you. In this case, I'm okay with it being a little bit open today. All right, so I've updated that metadata version and I'm metadata to have that dependency, and now I'm going to run kitchen converge again and see what happens. And in this case, I think this should work. I think it should run, and I think it should take care of any sort of apt-get updates and other stuff like that. The other does some other things. We notice, remember, here's all that output that we were kind of looking at, which is update success stamp. I think it, drops a configuration directory, drops some conf files inside of there, post success, it writes out some files, and it takes care of a number of things for us. So it actually, I don't know if it runs apt-get update, but it probably does. Maybe. I have to figure that out more, and we'll spend some more time with that. All right. Now, the next thing we want to do is use this app repository resource. So I'm going to copy this right out of this source code here and paste this here. And I think we're kind of done, except when we get to the template part. So I'm just going to minimize this and give us a little more space to work. All right. Oops. Wrong window. Here we go. That's us. Well, hold up. All right. Let's go here. There we go. All right, so here's the app repository resource. Let me do a little cleaning up of it. Now, the URI, I don't know. And the distribution, I don't know. And then the key, I don't know. And this key server. So we could look at the app documentation. I think I have that open. We can see an example, right? That might be useful to take a look at. It also might be, good. We could go through here and see some examples. The other way we could do this is actually start to deconstruct or figure out what is going on or what's being specified inside of essentially the other cookbook, inside the Jenkins cookbook, see what's going on. I think the repository part, as we're going to see, is based on where we're actually getting things from, like where are we pulling this repository from. And I think in our case it might be this value right here. But let's just actually find that inside of the community cookbook. And I think that's a great exercise to figure out. So here, I'm back here, I'm in a cookbook, I'm in the community cookbook, and it's got all these node attributes that I want to translate to actual values and sort of understand this. And the best place to find that, of course, is to return back and look in the attributes folder. Now in the attributes folder, there's a default, and then there's a master, and then an ops code. If I look inside here, the default doesn't contain anything except Java versions. So let's take a look at master, because remember, it was something about master install for packages and whatnot. So here, let's look for repository and see what comes up. So I'm going to do a find in repository. There we go. When Debian used this value right here. So that is the value that we're using. That looks exactly like the value specified down here. So it does look right. So there's that value right there highlighted, and then there's our same value right here. So I'm going to take that value, and I'm just going to replace it. I'm going to hard code this. And I know, but again, we would probably want to use the community cookbook version, but here as we're practicing, it's nice to kind of see this implementation, sort of simplify it before we make it more complicated again. All right, distribution is binary slash. That binary slash looks like this right here, so I feel pretty confident leaving that. Now the key part seems like maybe this, where we get the key from. I would guess that, but we can also go back to the documentation here, and we can say, where's the repository key? Yep, same thing. Grab this link right here. So that's the same value that we were grabbing our link here. So I'm going to copy from here the remote file, the key, and I'm going to replace this right there. Yes. Okay. And I don't know if we have a key server, so I'm not going to worry about a key server. We never had a key server value. We just pulled the key down. Now with that set, I think we will see this work. So I think we can actually take care of all of this. We don't need this anymore. So I'm just going to comment all that out. And now we have all of this replaced with this one app repository value. Now we'll return to the command line and we'll do a kitchen converge. Now this kitchen converge is not the final test that we would possibly use. but this is a pretty decent test to figure out like what's happening in terms of what's going on. I mean, so it's not the final test we do, right? It's going to tell us that we haven't broken anything, but what it's not going to tell us is whether this will work on a brand new installation, right? If we were on Kitchen Verify right after this, we wouldn't know whether we got this thing right. In interest of time, I think we've got about 15 minutes. I'm not going to run through that process, but that's something that I would do, and I think we should verify eventually, right? Is to make sure we can do that. Actually, I mean, we could do something like that, which is, you know, if we can't pull down Jenkins, well, we've already added it to the app repository. We'd have to remove it. Yeah, so I don't know if we can actually test this without rebuilding the system, and that's something I might want to do. And actually, I'll do that. I'll do that right now. So let's destroy it, and then we'll do a verify afterwards. And then we'll work on something in the background, because I want to know a little bit more about what this is actually doing. So before I sort of accept code and just kind of go, yeah, that's working for me, and I think it's working for me, or something like that, I want to know a little bit more about the code that we're working with. Now, you see here, I want to look to see what is this app repository, what's the default action for it? And then of course, when we look at the default action, what actually takes place? Like, what is going on in some of the things? Is it doing exactly what we built here? You know, could we have built our own resource and it would be simpler? You know, accepting this community code makes me nervous in the sense that, you know, I have to support this or possibly support this. So it'd be great if I understood more about this. So I'm going to open up, again, that apt cookbook, and let's peek around inside of it. So let's look in the providers file. Remember, the providers file is implementation. I'm going to use another shortcut key inside of Atom, which is Command R on your Mac. It might be Control R. Instead of the fuzzy find, which is Command T or Control T, Command R lets you look for all methods within a file for particular languages. In our case, we're looking for maybe an action. Looking for an install. You know what? Let me start with the resources file, because I want to see what are the actions available. So the actions are add and remove. The default action is add. So let's go back to the providers and let's see if we can find an add. So I can't find an add, and the reason for that is because the fuzzy find for methods only works on Ruby methods, but because actions are defined in blocks, here you see at the bottom, here's an action remove, right? This one right there. That where there's an action, it doesn't actually come up in the fuzzy find, so that's not great, but we'll still be able to use the fuzzy find. So that's remove. I bet this is add. Okay, so let's look at the add implementation. It tells us that the new resource, it says, if there's a key server and there's a key, install the key from the key server. Else, if there's a key, install the key from the URI. And we could look at that helper method if we wanted to find it. So I could do that Command R, install from this, and it looks like what it says is URI, find this, split the last key, so grab the key value out of it, save this in the cache file. If it starts with HTTP, then use a remote file and save it. Otherwise, you might pull it from somewhere and then do some validation for it, etc., etc. Okay, that's pretty cool. All right, so there's a little more implementation. I'm going to skip over that and continue on. So there's some good work going on here. Now let's get back to add. Okay, so then it says set up a file that does nothing, and then set up a gen caches, which does nothing, and then set up an apt get update, which has a bunch of other interesting things that also does nothing. But this one notifies gen caches to run immediately. So if this gets called, then this will get called. And then finally, if we get down to here, so it says this is a new resource, URI. So if the URI starts with PPA, then it says build the repo, or build the repo if it doesn't start with a PPA. That's interesting. So build repo is something I'd like to take a look at because I don't understand it. And if I see here, here's the file resource, and I think the file resource is essentially, this looks familiar, etsy/app/sources.list.d something.list. So let's take a look. So didn't we do something like that? We had a file that was etsy/app/sources.list.d Jenkins.list. So the name, of course, is Jenkins, and so this is essentially the file we're writing out. And that'll do a create, it'll delete this update success timestamp, and it'll also run apt-get update immediately if this says to rebuild the cache. Okay. Let's look at build repo, because I'd love to know what build repo does, because build repo, whatever this result of this thing is, stores in this variable called repository, and then this repository is written into the content of this file. So I want to know what that looks like. Now, it's tricky, right? Because if I look at the build repo method, right here, it is a lot of commands and a lot of code to figure out what's going on here. And my mental understanding of what's going on with this code is, I don't know. I'm not even sure what's happening, exactly. I mean, I could figure this out, but I'd like to know what's happening in real time. So I'm going to walk through that process here. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a trick in this last little minute here to walk you through this process. So I'm going to go to the metadata file, and actually, I'm going to go to the metadata file. I'm going to go to the Burks file. So Burkshelf allows me to specify some dependencies. So I'm going to specify a dependency on the app cookbook. And I'm going to say that the app cookbook that I want to use is not anyone from the supermarket, but happens to be one that's out essentially on my file system. Remember, I cloned this cookbook down, so I can actually use it locally. So I'm going to pull that cookbook in. So this says don't use the community cookbook. I mean, use the community cookbook, but use the one that I locally have a copy of. And the next thing I want to do is actually, I want to put in a breakpoint here. So now that I'm using this code, I want to set up a breakpoint. So I'm going to use pry. Pry is a debugging tool available inside of Ruby, and thus it's available inside of any of these resources, anything that we write inside of Chef. So I'm going to require pry and then do a binding.pry here. And then in that binding.pry, hopefully what I'm hoping for is the pause here. I'm hoping that the breakpoint will happen here, and I'll be able to look and see what repo value happens to be before it gets returned to kind of get an idea of like all the parameters and all the things that happen to be built. And now I only need a way to execute this code. So I'm going to return return back to our second terminal, turn back to here, and a way that we can actually execute this code is running RSpec. Essentially executing our chef-spec test suite. So our chef-spec test suite will actually execute our default recipe. At least that's what essentially the auto-generated test happens to be. So in our case, if I run this, I hope to see that this breakpoint happens. And I've actually done this before in the past. I've set up these breakpoints and hoped that they would break at this moment. And I run this RSpec, and then well, in this case, I see a failure. So, oh, it says error evaluating error occurred while reading the Burkshelf file. So let's look at the Burkshelf file. Perhaps I made a mistake here. So this is the app cookbook. Let's return back to this one. Oh, I said cookbooks instead of cookbook. Let's just run chef exec RSpec again. When you run chef-spec, it automatically invokes Burkshelf. If you look at the spec helper file, it says chef-spec Burkshelf here. So it's automatically invoking Burkshelf to load up its dependencies and things like that. All right, and it tells us that there is an error. It appears that Chef could not find the resource on a given platform as in 12.4. Chef conditionally loads resources based on the operating system. So we actually didn't get the work that we want. We need to make sure we specify the platform. So you see this line right here, it's telling us we should specify a platform and a version. So let's look at our default test. And let's go here. And yeah, when all attributes are default on, and we're saying default on, let's say on Ubuntu. And then here I'm going to say the platform is Ubuntu. And then the version happens to be 14.04. All right, I'm going to save that and now run this. Now hopefully we'll get rid of that error message, but I think there's going to be a little bit more work that we're going to have to do. And I'm familiar with this because pulling in custom resources, what happens is when you pull in a custom resource, in this case, my hope, of course, was to have that breakpoint happen, for this code to be triggered because this actually takes place. But the thing is, with chef-spec, it's all done in memory. So when you run this like this, it doesn't actually follow or move into that custom resource and actually execute any of the code in there, unless you tell it to. So let's quickly look that up. So if I go to GitHub and I go to chef-spec, there's a thing about custom resources here, and I believe they talk about it here, which is called step into, my LWRP. And that's what we want to do. We're going to step into it, just for now. This is not something that you would leave in your code. Usually you don't step into anyone else's, you don't usually step into someone else's custom resource. But in our case, we want to step into it, because if we don't step into it, it's not actually going to invoke that code, because it's just in memory, and it's like, yeah, this is good enough. All right, so this is going to do chef exec RSpec. Hopefully in this case we're going to get a pause that we're hoping for, and we don't. So there's something missing still, and I'm trying to remember. So this is step into the app cookbook. We've got the right platform, and I think, this should be working, right? So let me close down this. Maybe let's make sure that the Burks file, let me just run Burks just in case, make sure everything is good. And then let me run chef exec RSpec. So the Burks command, when I run that, ensures that I'm using the dependencies from the local location. So it says using apps here, /app instead of pulling down the remote one. And it doesn't do it here. Now, this is what I'm afraid of, so I'm gonna see if I can do Jenkins experiment. So I had this experiment that I was playing with, and I've done this before. I just want to compare my code to see what I did here differently, and see if I did something different. So, app repository, that's what it is. It's a typo. App is the name of the cookbook, not the name of the resource. So that's what's missing here. App is not essentially the resource I'm using. Remember, I'm using the app repository lightweight resource provider. So I must use that to step into it. So a little typo there, and again, I got no feedback in terms of what's going on. It just says didn't stop for me. And I think now we're going to see some success in the remaining minutes here. All right. And so what I'm hoping for is that this is going to pause in the execution and open up a prompt for me. And this prompt allows me to enter any command. So let's talk about what's going on here. So here it's going to tell me what file it found and then what line on that file that I found, line 36. So this is the file, providers repository.rb, line 36. And then here's a summary of all the lines of where it's at. Here's our breakpoint. And essentially we have a prompt right down here, and that prompt is exactly where we are in the code on line 136. So we can type any command that we want, and we can actually see what was the URI passed in, what was the distribution that was passed in, right? We can see all the variables. We can also do ls, and ls is going to show us a big list of all the possible methods and values available at this moment. And we can see there, here's a bunch of the local variables, all of the local variables that we have. So I'm in this sort of list mode, so I'm going to do a :q to quit out. And really I'm mostly interested, where am I again? I am going to mostly just, I'm interested in the repo value. What file I wrote out to the system. There we go. So we see in this case what's happening. We've got this being written out to the file, and this looks a lot very similar to what we wrote before. So I'm going to go back to our original implementation inside of the recipe, and I hopefully am going to see something that looks familiar. So go to the default recipe. What did we write out to the file? It said, hey, write out to this file etsy/app sources list jenkins.list deb http debian binary /. So really we were writing out this line, and if I return back to here, that's exactly what's being written out here, except maybe with a little more spaces, a new line character, etc., etc. But for the most part, we're able to figure out a little bit more of what's going on here. So the build repo part works in a very similar way than what we were doing as well. And I feel a little more confident using this cookbook. I know a little bit more of what's going on here. Now there's of course more things that we could explore. Community cookbooks are really powerful, and they provide a lot of functionality. So it's nice to know a little bit about them, right? To spend a little time with them and almost maybe recreate them to help us understand them. All right. So let's return back to the terminal because I want to see what failed or what passed here. And it looks like we got a failure with that installation. It seems like this failed. And you know what? I have a feeling that it failed, but I think it failed because we asked too quickly or too soon after. I've run into this experience sometime with Test Kitchen where if you're working with it, sometimes it'll converge, and then of course that process and that virtual machine will be spinning up, right? Starting up. And Java applications, oftentimes they take a lot longer to spin up. So here, I think if we run kitchen verify again, I think we're going to see some success. I think everything got installed correctly. We just needed to give it a little more time. Yep, and there we go. One example, 0 failures, and we see some success. So here we are, our final recipe. It feels strange to delete all this code. You know, I wrote all that code, but maybe it's time to delete it and say goodbye to it. I'm going to save it, and let's finish up with the git commit. So I'll do git status, I'll do an add, and I'll say git commit, and I update the recipe. So it updates the cookbook to use the apt repository custom resource. This makes a cleaner and easier to understand default recipe. Alright, and that looks like we just about ran out of time. I will push this up. So I'll use my hub create, I'll do chef training, and then here I'll set up a Jenkins one. And then I'll do a shortcut, another one of mine, git push origin master there, and I'll push that up. And then here we are. Here's the final version. I'll paste this into the chat for those that are here. And of course, for those that are joining us later, you know, that kind of thing, you'll be able to find it in the notes down below. So in this episode, we took a script, we converted it into a recipe, and then we redefined that recipe using community cookbooks. And what we did was really copy the Jenkins Cookbook, and ultimately we probably use the Jenkins Cookbook. But it's important to understand code, and reading code doesn't always give you that functionality, doesn't give you that value. So what's helpful is actually explore that code, working with it. And that's what we did here. We worked with the code, we almost re-implemented it, and in the process we wasted an hour, but really we just practiced. And now in the future, when someone asks us about this cookbook, if it causes a problem or if it can be upgraded or how does it do what it does, we'll have a better understanding of how to troubleshoot it, how to expand it, and how to maybe add new features to it. So it's really important for us to know. So again, I'd like to thank you for joining me. Have a wonderful day. Happy automating.